Picture a desert so dead that the people living beside it just called it the Sea of Death. No water, no shade. Sand that buried roads within a season of them being built. Now picture that exact same stretch of ground today. Solar panels stretching to the horizon. Sheep grazing in the shade underneath them. Fields of crops where there used to be nothing but dunes. This is the Kubuqi Desert in Inner Mongolia, China. And it just went through one of the most dramatic transformations anywhere on the planet. 3,200 square kilometers. That's roughly a third of the entire desert, turned green. An area that size used to be exactly like everything around it. Flat dead, the same color as the sky on a bad day. Now it isn't. This is Titan build. This is the story of how a country turned a third of one of its worst deserts around, using a solar wall strong enough to power a small nation. And it started in 1988, with one man, a salt factory, and a road that kept disappearing under the sand. To understand how strange that transformation really is, you have to understand what Kubuqi used to be. It's China's 7th largest desert, sitting along a bend of the Yellow River, close enough to Beijing that its sandstorms used to reach the capital. For centuries, it did what deserts do. It grew. Wind stripped away anything that tried to take root, and every year the Sea of Death pushed a little further into the grassland around it, swallowing pasture that herding families depended on. In 1988, a young man named Wang Wenbiao took over a salt works sitting almost in the middle of it. The factory was failing. Worse, there was no reliable way to actually get the salt out. The access road the company depended on kept vanishing under fresh dunes, almost as fast as workers could clear it. He grew up in a family of sheep herders on the edge of this exact desert. He'd spent his whole childhood watching it advance. Watching Pasture, his own family, depended on disappear under sand a little more every year. This wasn't an abstract problem to him. It was the reason his family kept having to move. So he tried to build something the sand couldn't erase. Not a road this time. A living barrier. Workers planted rows of hardy desert shrubs and grasses along the road. Species that could survive on almost nothing. Their roots built to grab loose sand and hold it in place. It worked well enough to save the road. And somewhere in the middle of solving that one practical problem, Wang Wenbiao ended up with a much bigger idea. If a barrier like that could save one road, what could it do for an entire desert? That idea eventually became a company, and a decades-long campaign, backed by a mix of government support and private investment, to push vegetation back into Kubuqi at a scale nobody had attempted there before. Decades later, the United Nations would give Wang Wenbiao a title that sounds almost too neat to be real, son of the desert. It's the kind of nickname that only sticks if the transformation behind it is actually visible from a helicopter. The early tools were almost primitive compared to what would come later. Rows of straw and dried reeds, planted in overlapping grid patterns across bare dunes, cutting wind speed at ground level, just enough for a thin crust of soil to start forming. Into that crust went the same tough shrubs from the salt road. Plants that didn't need rich earth, just something to hold on to. It was slow. It was labor-intensive. And for years, it only nibbled at the edges of a desert that measured its own size in the tens of thousands of square kilometers. Then, in the 2000s, something changed the entire economics of fighting a desert this size. Solar power got cheap enough to build at a genuinely massive scale. And someone realized that a solar panel does more than generate electricity in a place like this. It also throws shade. That single insight is the real hinge of this entire story. A solar panel mounted a couple of meters above bare sand blocks a huge amount of direct sunlight and wind from ever reaching the ground underneath it. Less sun and less wind means less evaporation. Less evaporation means whatever moisture does fall actually stays in the soil long enough for something to grow. Plant a hardy species like licorice under and around the rows of panels, and you get a plant that not only survives, its roots start doing the same soil anchoring job the old straw grids did, except now for free. powered by infrastructure that's already generating income on its own. Put sheep and cattle in, between the rows to graze on what grows, and the same acre of former dead sand is now doing 3 jobs at once: producing electricity, producing food, and holding the desert in place. All without needing a separate irrigation network or a government check to keep it alive year after year. 3,200 square kilometers of that model, stitched together over roughly a decade, is what actually built the third of Kubuqi that's green today. The scale of what got measured afterward is hard to process in the abstract. Vegetation cover across the restored zone climbed past 50% on ground that used to register close to zero. The number of distinct species recorded living in the area went from around 120 to well over 500. Water retained in the restored soil and underground reserves rose from almost nothing to more than 25 billion cubic meters. And the restoration itself, mostly carried out by a single private company, working the land for profit as much as for ecology, generated an estimated $5 billion in what researchers call gross ecosystem product. The economic value of clean water, stable soil, and usable land that didn't exist there before. None of that happened because a government agency planted trees and hoped for the best. It happened because somebody found a way to make holding the desert back genuinely profitable, year after year, which is the one thing that reliably outlasts a funding cycle. Fly over the restored zone today, and the contrast with the untouched desert right next to it isn't subtle. On one side, the same flat, cracked, colorless ground that's been there for centuries, heat shimmering off it in visible waves. On the other, sometimes separated by nothing more than a service road, dark rows of panels, a green haze of shrub and crop underneath them, and actual shade, a resource this land hadn't had at any real scale in living memory. Pilots and researchers who've flown the line describe it less like watching a landscape change gradually, and more like crossing a border between 2 different climates in the space of a few seconds. And the project didn't stop at restoring what already existed. It kept building. Under construction right now, stretched along the edge of the desert, is something China is calling, only half jokingly, its own Great Wall. A corridor of solar panels, planned to run 400 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide, aiming for a maximum generating capacity of 100 gigawatts once it's finished, sometime around 2030. 100 gigawatts is not a small number. It's roughly the combined generating capacity of an entire mid-sized industrial country, sitting on ground that, less than 2 decades ago, could not reliably support a single blade of grass. Sections of it are already live. In December 2023, a single 2-gigawatt array at one site inside Kubuqi was connected to the national grid. At the time, the largest individual desert-based solar project of its kind ever to go online in China. Further south, a companion development is aiming for 16 gigawatts of total capacity on its own, 8 of it solar, spread across land that was, within living memory, simply sand. Seen from space, the change is now visible enough that satellite researchers have used it as a case study. Before and after imagery showing a dark, structured grid of panels spreading across terrain that used to be featureless beige, with faint green hallowing outward from its edges, where the shade and the shrubs have taken hold. But it would be dishonest to tell this story as a simple, unqualified triumph. And Titan Build has learned that lesson the hard way from other episodes. China has tried fighting its deserts at massive scale before, and it didn't always go well. A far larger, older program, launched decades before anyone thought to put solar panels in the sand, poured tens of billions of dollars into planting a wall of trees along the country's arid north. Much of it relied on a single fast, growing species, planted in dense blocks. Because a monoculture is simple to manage and quick to show results to government auditors. In some of the driest stretches, survival rates for those trees fell below 30%. A single pest outbreak once wiped out roughly 1 billion trees in one region in a matter of weeks. because a forest with no genetic diversity has nothing to slow a disease once it takes hold. Kubuqi's solar and shrub model has, so far, avoided that specific trap, largely because it isn't relying on one fragile species to do all the work, and because the economics don't depend entirely on continuous government funding to survive a bad decade. But it carries its own version of the same underlying risk. The model depends on a small number of hardy, repeatedly chosen plant species, and on a private company's continued financial interest in maintaining land it doesn't fully own outright. Critics have raised real questions about how much of the credit belongs to genuine ecological recovery versus aggressive land use rebranding for subsidies and green energy contracts, and about what happens to the shrubs and grazing land decades from now if a future owner decides the solar leases are worth more. Without the agricultural side of the arrangement attached, there's a harder, more physical limit too. All of this vegetation, however hardy, still draws on a water table that isn't infinite, in a region that is projected to get hotter and drier, not cooler and wetter, over the coming decades. Restoring a third of one desert does not automatically mean the other 2/3, or the deserts beyond it, follow the same path without the same investment, the same panels, and the same decades of patient work being repeated all over again. Even with those honest caveats sitting on top of it, the scale of what already stands in Kubuqi today is difficult to overstate. A stretch of land that used to earn a name meaning death now generates enough electricity to matter on a national grid, grows a cash crop underneath the very panels producing that electricity, and supports grazing animals in the shade of infrastructure that didn't exist a generation ago. Step back, and the transformation genuinely reads as two different photographs of the same coordinates, taken decades apart, that almost nobody would believe show the same place. One frame, empty sand under a flat, colorless sky, a road disappearing into it. The other frame, dark rows of glass and silicon catching the sun, green stretching out beneath and beyond them, sheep grazing in shadow that, 30 years ago, simply did not exist there. The sea of death didn't get filled in by hand, one bucket of water at a time. It got out, engineered, one shrub, one straw grid, one solar panel at a time, until holding the sand in place stopped being an act of charity and started being a business someone actually wanted to keep running. This channel exists for stories exactly like this one. Subscribe to Titan Build for the next impossible build. Drop your answer in the comments. If the only way to make a country actually commit to fighting its own desert for 30 straight years is to make holding it back profitable, does it matter anymore whether anyone involved cared about the desert at all?